Hello, I am Zainab, and today we will be talking about Gallup Pakistan's analysis of the World Bank Enterprise Survey 2022. In today's session, we will be looking at gender or female representation in firms in Pakistan and then comparing them to those in South Asia and the entire world. Gallup Pakistan has not conducted the survey work for this series. We are only analyzing the publicly disclosed data and reports provided by the World Bank. This is a public service activity done on individual initiative of Gallup Pakistan and not in any way endorsed or commissioned or supported by World Bank or its agents. Some key findings from the female representation section of the study are that for every firm in Pakistan with a female owner, there are 3 in South Asia and 5 in the entire world. This means that female participation in ownership for Pakistani firms is quite low. More on this later. The second finding we get is that female participation in ownership is still more compared to a majority female participation in ownership. This means that even though there are some firms that have females in ownership positions, there are much fewer firms. Actually, there are only 2% firms that have a majority female ownership compared to 14% of the entire world and the 9% of South Asia. Next, if you look at the manufacturing sector, we will see that in the production sector, for a single female production worker in the manufacturing firms in Pakistan, there are 5 in South Asia and 7 in the entire world. This means that for Pakistan, women in production roles are much less than those in South Asia and the world. Next, we will break down each of these categories systematically. First, let's look at female participation in employment, top management, and ownership. If we look at percentage of firms with female ownership, we will see that there are 5% firms in Pakistan that have female ownership, female participation in ownership. That means they have some women in the ownership positions. This compared to the 14% of South Asia and 32% of the world is quite low. Next, we look at percent of firms with a female top manager. This is one position below the ownership position, but still it's a woman in a position of authority in a firm. Here, we see that only 3% of Pakistani firms have a female top manager. Please note that this is even lower than the percent of firms with female participation in ownership. However, these figures for percent of firms with female top managers are low all across our comparative categories. There are only 10% such firms in South Asia and 18% such firms in the entire world. The proportion of permanent full-time workers that are female are only 3% for Pakistan, compared to 17% in South Asia and 32% in the entire world. This implies that there are much less women working in firms in South Asia and even fewer firms who have female employees in Pakistan. The proportion. Next, we look at female participation in ownership versus a majority female participation in ownership. This is a very nuanced difference between the two terms. Female ownership, participation in ownership implies that there may be 1 or 2 or a few women in ownership positions in firms. However, a majority female ownership applies that there are more women than men in ownership positions in those firms. If we look at Pakistan, we see that there are only 2% such firms out of the 1,300 surveyed that had women in a majority female ownership positions, and 5 that had just women in ownership positions. Compare this to South Asia and all the countries in the world, we see that there are lesser proportion of women in majority female ownership compared to just female ownership. This shows a global trend of less women in ownership positions, whether majority or otherwise. However, the results for South Asia and the entire world are still much, much greater than Pakistan. For every 1 woman in a majority female ownership in Pakistan, there are almost 5 in South Asia and almost 7 in the entire world. At last, we will look at female participation in employment for production and non-production sectors. Here we will see that in the manufacturing firms, the proportion of permanent full-time production workers that are female are only 4% for Pakistan. On the contrary, there are 20% women who are production workers for South Asia and 27% for the entire world. This shows that South Asia is not very behind the world, but Pakistan is very behind even South Asia in this regard. Proportion of permanent full-time non-production workers that are female for Pakistan is only 1% higher at 5%. It is about the same for South Asia at 20% and much higher for the entire world at 38%. One point of consideration that I would point out for this analysis is that out of the 1,300 firms studied in the World Bank Enterprise Survey for 2022, a lot of sectors were not included. For example, mostly the manufacturing and services sector was included in this analysis and in these surveys. The agricultural sector, the mining sector, the fishing sectors, for example, were not included. And it might be possible that there are more women working in the informal economy or in these sectors than were recorded in this survey. While these are very informative insights, they should be treated with caution and should be taken with a grain of salt, and due diligence should be conducted before reaching any concrete conclusions.